Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to host this event on Wednesday's election in the Netherlands. I welcome you on behalf of the Netherlands American Foundation, as well, co-sponsor of today's event. Good afternoon as well to our online and television viewership. Please submit your questions to shantanu.kamat@aei.org. If you have any questions and you're not in the room, you can find that information on the event page as well. As those of you gathered here likely know, Wednesday's Dutch elections produced a close finish between the 5 largest parties, with D66 becoming the largest party for the first time in its 60-year existence, and its 38-year-old leader, Rob Jetten, now widely seen as the next prime minister. D66 is closely followed by Geert Wilders' PVV, Party for Freedom. PVV lost about a third of its support compared to 2023, when we had our most recent elections, and when it surprised friend and foe by winning the election by a wide margin. You should all have a handout here, those of you in the room, that illustrates the new political spectrum. You'll see the expected composition of the new second chamber, which is our lower house, which was elected on Wednesday, as well as the composition of the upper chamber, the Senate. The Senate, just for background, was elected in May of 2023 and will serve until 2027. This is what it looks like. Dutch senators are part-time elected officials, and the chamber cannot really initiate or amend legislation, but it can block legislation. And so a governing coalition ideally holds a majority of Senate seats or something close to it. And so as we'll talk about potential coalitions in the lower chamber, one thing to remember is despite a number of defections, the farmer citizen movement continues to hold a large number of Senate seats, and the Green Left Labor also has a relatively high number of senators, and so they bring those senators to the table were they to become part of a coalition. And so that's a sort of important background. The House, or the second chamber, which was elected on Wednesday, decides who gets to form the government. As you can see, it's quite fragmented. And in addition, most parties have excluded the PVV from consideration for the formation of a new government. And so at least 4 parties will be needed to get to a majority. Our panelists will shortly tell us which 4 or 5 and which policies they will decide to implement. Now, with that background, let's turn to today's run of show. We are about to hear from Birgitta Tazelaar, the Dutch ambassador to the United States. After her remarks, we will hear from our panel of experts. Matthias Matthijs is Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations and Associate Professor of Political Economy at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Constance Stelzenmüller is the Director of the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings. And Marnix van Rij is Alternate Executive Director at the IMF. He was Deputy Finance Minister in the 4th Rutte cabinet, which is now 2 cabinets ago, and served on 2 occasions as party chair of the Christian Democratic Appeal Party, one of the victors of Wednesday's election. With that, let me welcome Ambassador Tazelaar, Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States of America, previously Deputy Director General for International Cooperation at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a variety of other roles there. Ambassador, welcome. I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Stan, and it's good to be here again. I hope we're not going to make this a habit. I would like to give a few takeaways about the results of this election, and say a few words about what coalition possibilities there are. I'll keep it short because we've got a great panel for that, what the process looks like, and maybe a few words on foreign affairs and the impact that a coalition could have on foreign affairs. I think a couple of major takeaways. The turnout was again relatively high, between 77% and 82% as in the previous cycles, although maybe slightly less this year compared to a couple of years ago, but all in all a good turnout. As the last time, the center-right to far-right, they have a majority in parliament, so they have 90 out of 150 seats, which is like 60% is right-wing. And within the right wing, the far right populist parties have almost a third of the seats, which is slightly less than 2 years ago. Of course, the biggest winner, as Stan mentioned, is a D66, 26 seats out of 150, maybe 27, we don't know yet, which means that it is the smallest, biggest party ever, which shows that there is fragmentation in our political landscape. Out of the 5, let's say, serious contenders for the first place, 4 out of these are center parties, so center left and center right. And you could conclude based on this that Dutch citizens seem to want to have a government which is leaning towards the center. There is also a issue shift compared to a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, it was mainly all about asylum and security or migration. And now it is a little bit broader when it comes to subjects. It was also about leadership, about housing affordability and availability, health costs, and also political stability and so-called normalcy within the political system. But again, also migration and asylum was still a major topic during the elections and will therefore also be a major topic in the coalition building. Well, the counting is still ongoing. We're still waiting for 100,000 votes being counted from abroad, and one particular community is still being counted, so we're still waiting to have the final results, most likely beginning of next week. Now, if you look at the landscape, and again, it's not my business to predict, but it's also very obvious what the possibilities are. It's going to be either a coalition, let's say the center coalition, containing 2 center-right and 2 center-left parties that will have a very comfortable majority, or the other alternative is to have a center coalition together, which leans more towards the right. But again, that depends if D66 will have that 1 extra vote, because then they will have a majority. If not, they will need 5 parties, and that makes it again more difficult. A coalition with the PVV, as Stan mentioned, in the coalition is very unlikely because the major parties have ruled out governing with them again because they walked out from the previous coalition. Once everything is counted, we'll have this particular phases. Just to remind you again, we'll have a scouting phase with an explorer that will sit down with all the parties to find out from these parties what kind of coalition they think is the most likely and durable coalition that can come to a compromise. After that is a negotiation phase, so the negotiator will then talk to the parties that are most likely to form that government, and once they agreed on content, there will be a so-called formateur, a cabinet builder, and then the people will be chosen, you know, which party gets which portfolio, and who are the people to be chosen for those portfolios. How long can this take? Very long. The longest time it ever took was 299 days. The shortest one, I think, is close to 40 days. The last time it took 220 days. I think most parties would like it to go a little bit quicker than that, especially because we've had now a government only for a year and a couple of months, and the people want some stability. Hopefully they can manage that. What does it mean for our foreign policy? And again, this is not my own analysis. I'm basing myself on also think tanks who've looked at all the programs of the political parties. And if you have the most likely scenario of a center coalition, we can see that on EU matters, this coalition would then be a bit stronger, leaning towards the EU. It would be, when it comes to NATO, it would not much would change, I would say. NATO will still be seen as the cornerstone of our security, although these parties also feel that there should be a strong EU pillar within NATO. The 3.5% to 5% that will remain, that has been agreed upon, and it will not change. Then when it comes to US-Netherlands relations, there we will I think see a continued strong transatlantic relationship, although also parties in this particular coalition have also said that we would need a more balanced, less dependent relationship upon the US with more strategic autonomy for Europe. When you look at Ukraine and the eastern flank, whereas in 2020 the opinions on Russia still vary, that has completely changed after the invasion in 2022. And these parties really see Russia as a direct threat to European and therefore also Dutch security. And they will, most of these parties have really explicitly said that they will continue and want to continue supporting Ukraine for the long term. When it comes to development cooperation, that will be tough discussion, tough negotiations, because some parties want to budget more on development cooperation. Others want to go back to the 0.7 GDP landmark. So that's on foreign affairs. Of course, the major topics to be discussed will be on internal affairs, housing, as we mentioned, migration, healthcare. But I will leave that for now, and very much look forward to what the panel has to say. And thank you, Stan, again for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Before we dive into the issue, so to speak, I thought we should talk a bit about the process from here on out, how the negotiation process works, how to think about the coalition formation process, which is such a big part of Dutch politics. And Marnix, I thought I'd start with you and ask you to share your thoughts on the process, like the outcomes, etc.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Stan. In the Netherlands, you can win the elections and you can lose the formation, and the other way around. You could say that is a kind of an unwritten rule. So the outcome of the elections is there, and you read in the foreign media, Democrat 66 won. That's the new prime minister. Yeah, that could happen, but that depends on the formation process. As the ambassador just described, I'm not going to repeat that. The first phase is the appointment of a scout. And there we immediately have a problem, because normally speaking, that should have been done today. But there's unclarity about the formal outcome of the election. So Geert Wilders has said, I'm not going to sit around the table with the other 14 leaders under the chairmanship of the chair of the second chamber. I wait till Tuesday. Tuesday actually is not the formal results will be published then by the Electoral College. That will be done on Friday. But at least then we know what the outcome is of the Dutch people who voted abroad. Well, it's highly probable that Democrat 66 has the most votes, and also the 27 seats, most probable an extra seat. So then they will take the lead. So it is probable that a scout or two scouts will be appointed. That can also be a scout of the VVD, the second party. We have seen that since we introduced the scout, because in the past the king was doing this type of job till 2012. The last couple of years, it was not always a big success, these scouts. To put it mildly, I'm not going to go in details. I hope that this time the scouts can do what they have to do. They have to work fast, because when the new members of the second chamber will be inaugurated, that is, I think, the 10th of November, then normally speaking, around that time, the results should be known, and then the informateur can start. I would say he's more he or she, and can also be two, mediator, who is sitting around the table with the negotiating parties. Well, two other observations, and then I will stop, because we can talk a lot about it and we can speculate a lot about it. The voters have given a strong signal, because Democrat 66 won, but also the Christian Democrats won. You don't read that so much in the analysis, especially not the foreign analysis, but the Christian Democrats went up from 5 to 18. And the Christian Democrats positions itself, like Democrat 66, more in the center. And more with an agenda like, we have to fix the things in the country, with what Democrat 66 actually also did. And I think that that could be the main engine for a potential new coalition. The VVD has done a remarkably good job in the last 2 weeks before the elections, because Jezielkus was the leader of the VVD, was not doing well in the polls. And they lost actually only 1 or 2 seats, 2 seats. So they have actually quite strong position as number 2. They all excluded PVV. I should have started with that. Green Left Social Democrats had expected more. They are at the stage of a merger, which I personally find an extremely interesting development and a necessary development, because it's a consolidation at the center-left side. On the other hand, they have 20 seats, and the leader stepped down, Timmermans, and he made space for new leadership. And now, that's my last point, we also see a change the last 2 years in a generational change. So you have Rob Jetten, 38 years. You have Henry Bontebal from CDA, 42 years. Then you have Jezielkus, who is 48 years, but she looks younger. And then you have most probably Jesse Klaver, who is also in his early 40s, who is most probably going to be the leader of Green Left. It's really that new generation, which also claims to get rid of the old politics, who will most probably a chance now. And then really the last word, I don't believe that the right has the majority in the Netherlands. It's just, what is the right? Yes, PVV, I would count. I would definitely count also Ja 21 to that, and Forum for Democracy. And then you have the dogmatic Protestant party, SGP. That's around 50 seats. They don't have a majority. CDA is not a right party, it's a center party, as I said. VVD is a center-right party. So I would like to stop here.
Very good. One thing I wanted to ask, the Netherlands has local elections in March.
Yes.
Do you think there's any chance there'll be a new government before that?
Now, that's a very good question. There's always 2 theories there. Theory 1 is that the parties who are going to sit around the table and have to form that cabinet, they take something and they have to give away something. And the one who has, in the image, given too much away is that party willing to go to the voters for the municipality elections. That's always a kind of a political judgment which have to be made. Personally, I think that regardless the municipality elections, this takes 6 months, and it's also necessary, or 5 to 6 months, because the mistake, also in the cabinet where I was part of, it took 9 months. They were beating around the bush for 9 months, and then finally they started negotiating about the content. So we got a coalition agreement. There were so many loose ends. It's better to discuss now in depth, especially on the sensitive points, migration, asylum, but also nitrogen, but also the labor market, but also what type of economy would we like to have, to discuss that in depth and to have full clarity and commitment, and not like loose ends, like in my case. For example, I was supposed to come up with a tax reform about the income tax from wealth that has to be based on realization. And then I said, and what do you mean? Nobody could tell me because they had not discussed it through. Okay, then I started, of course, the whole process.
Very good. I want to stress the generational change point because it's really in part the doing of the voters too. You had 3 sort of major figures in Dutch politics who started their career in the 1990s. Geert Wilders, which party lost a third of its seat. Frans Timmermans, who obviously had a period in European politics, but had been active in Dutch politics prior to that, lost quite badly too. And then Pieter Omtzigt, who after Geert Wilders was the longest serving member of parliament, the party that he is really at the center of, that he's the founder of, new social contract lost all of its 20 seats. They were part of the outgoing coalition. So that generation is really gone now. They're replaced by elderly millennials, as it should be. Matthias, I wanted to ask you. So obviously, you know, you often have these broad developments in Europe that sort of track each other, sort of comparable dynamics, comparable sets of issues that ebb and flow. What do you make of these results of this election?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I must say I grew up in Flanders, so we always looked up north to the Netherlands as like our big brother, but I always had a hard time making sense of it, given that it's like so proportionally represented, very different from Belgium. But also, I mean, the first thing I would note is that I grew up with the CDA, the VVD, and the PVDA, so the liberals, the socialists, and the Christian Democrats, always being much bigger than they are now. Right? I mean, that's one thing. And the ambassador stressed this as well. I mean, the biggest party is also the smallest, biggest party ever, right? And so I think that makes this very interesting. I mean, if you look at these results that are very nicely put here, I mean, there really is only one option, right? And that's why I think it's going to take them longer than expected, because it includes losers, right? Especially, I think, Green and Social Democratic party. That
you're saying the obvious option here, you're saying
is the middle
one here.
Yeah, the broad center is the only one actually with a majority if you look at based on the preliminary result, because 75 is not a majority, right? And also, I mean, as we discussed on, I think Ja 21 is still far too extreme in its views on Europe and in its views on migration for a broad centrist, three other parties. You could see Ja 21 with VVD. I have a harder time Ja 21 with D66, right? That's it. D66 for an American audience, I don't know how you explain this, but it's basically Clinton 1990s, Blair 1990s, but without don't ask, don't tell, right? I mean, it's a very progressive, it's what we kind of think of when we think of the Netherlands, right? A market economy, competitive, and very confident, very forward-looking, very, very, very progressive. I think they represent that, and I think they captured the zeitgeist in a way, right? So I think a lot of analyses are already being written. The obvious point is that the far right didn't really lose; it's just that they fragmented, right? So Wilders lost votes to the Forum for Democracy, and of course this Ja 21, the Forum for Democracy, I think a meaner version of PVV, if that's possible. Ja 21 maybe slightly cleaner.
A little more conspiracy oriented. I wouldn't call it meaner. Yeah. It's a lot more, you know, processing of mental health issues in public, that kind of stuff.
That stuff. So when you look at the issues, I actually see quite a lot of similarities what we're going to see here. So if you think of where we're sitting right now in the United States, the two main issues in the next 12 months, in the run-up to the midterms, will be housing and medical costs, right? Pharmaceuticals, all that sort of stuff. That's where I expect this Trump administration to take two major initiatives to deal with the inflationary effects that we've seen from the tariffs and from some of the other policies, from the tax cuts. And those were actually very important as well. So why did the socialists and the Greens not do very well, or not as well as expected, or even as was polled? It wasn't a big issue, climate, right? I mean, Rob Jetten, his profile in a previous life was as climate and energy minister, right? And he was actually criticized for being too much about climate, from going on and on and on about it. He avoided that this time. And similar, I mean, the PVDA, very strong on housing, and in a way that, you know, you see it here with Mamdani in New York and others, right? That affordable housing is at the heart and center, especially in cities. Somehow they couldn't push that agenda. Maybe it was the figure of Timmermans himself. So it is interesting, right? In the end, it was still about migration, this election. It was a very important issue. People didn't really change their minds on this, with the exception that most of the centrist and either center-left parties basically moved further towards the right a bit, but said we need to do, I mean, a lot of the taboos from 10 years ago are completely broken on migration.
Something new that we saw this time was that both Green Left, PVDA, and the SP, the Socialist Party, which is a smaller left-wing party, formerly Maoist one, I think, they both set explicit targets for net migration flows, which, I don't know, clearly it didn't work well for them. I think it's probably a mistake for them to make it to work to make migration a more central issue. It also, I think, accepts a frame of restrictionism that's not helpful to them because no one believes that they are actually going to
They believe,
restrict migration flows more than others. On a pure policy level, it's very difficult within the European Union to actually target net migration numbers just because you have free movement. And so, you can restrict immigration from outside the European Union a bit. You can like raise the minimum wage to disincentivize migration from within Europe, maybe. But setting a hard target, I think, was. I mean, I understand the impulse because they feel like they have to do something on migration. I think that was a big mistake. They set it at about 50,000 a year in net terms. So that's, to give you a sense, that's comparable to what the U.S. had sort of before the Biden administration, the previous decade. So the U.S. back then had net migration of about 1 million a year, and so 50,000 in the Netherlands is 50, 60 is broadly comparable to that. Clearly, that strategy didn't work out, and as long as migration remains a central issue, I think we're seeing that the center left in particular is just really struggling.
Struggles, yeah. And they should know from the United Kingdom that setting numerical targets is a terrible idea because it's very hard to stick to it, even for center-right parties. But so that's the, and I want Constanze to speak to the issues here. But I think that's one thing I think she'll remember very well from 2015. I mean, the kind of language that we used in 2015 during the migration crisis was very different, right? That's all those taboos, the way thinking about pushing back migrants, some of the language that's used, that's gone. So I expect a long formation and a sort of balanced centrist coalition with two center-left and two center-right centrist parties. But I also expect the left to have to compromise on migration on this one. And then the question is, what will the right compromise on?
Yeah, that's not going to be, yeah, I think it's going to be a difficult, if you think of the other issues, that there's housing, like most Western advanced economies, the Netherlands has just failed to produce enough housing. It's really a supply side issue. In the Netherlands, it's complicated by the fact that the country is pretty dense. For years now, we've had what we call our nitrogen crisis that Marnix alluded to briefly, where emissions from basically any economic activity have to be capped or reduced or offset. And so everything requires a permit. I don't think anyone has a particularly good solution to that. Robjette, the D66 leader, has proposed building 10 new cities, as he puts it. But then, you look into the actual proposal, and it's more like, we're going to do some infill here. We're going to build maybe 1 or 2 extra cities. And we're going to put one in Flevoland. There's no thinking about, the infrastructure that's going to have to be associated with those cities. I'm pretty worried that that's not going to get solved. And then on healthcare, you just have the same issue set as everywhere, right? The choice between rationing or higher payments at points of service. So those issues were all pretty central to the campaign, but they're all domestic issues. What's amazing when you sort of follow the, transatlantic discourse here in DC is the issue set is a completely different one. Right? It's about defense spending, it's about trade policy, and it's about the Draghi report and competitiveness. None of that was, I don't want to say it wasn't mentioned, but it was barely mentioned. Of course, the defense spending increases are present in the background as parties come up with their budgets. But Constanze, can you tell us why those issue sets are so separate? Because of course, some of the responsibility lies with the Commission for those issues, but not. A lot of the tone is set by the Council. Trade policy has become intertwined with all sorts of other issues, and some trade policy is just done at the national level, right? Export restrictions and the like. What do you make of that? How are you gonna change it? More importantly.
First of all, thank you very much as the German at Brookings for inviting your neighbor, in the double sense, to sit on this panel. I consider that an honor on both levels. I've done it before, but the fact that you re-invited me is...
it's a good sign.
Yes, a good sign, yeah. At least we can get along. That's good. I mean, the Belgians is another matter, right? But anyway, sorry, that was a joke, just to make sure. I also say condolences on this picture. That's a lot of parties. And that's a semi-joke. I'll explain why in a second.
I mean, the good thing is there's no new ones on this.
That's true.
On this board. That's not a guarantee.
And one is gone.
Yeah, but still, it's sobering. And what I wanted to talk about, if I may,
You can completely ignore my question.
Yeah, no, not at all. But I wanted to say it's perhaps helpful to insert all this into the larger question, not just of transatlantic relations, but the fact that the three major economies of Europe, France, the UK, and Great Britain, will have elections in the next 4 years. The French will have a presidential election in 2027. The Brits and the Germans, unless they break up beforehand, which is actually more difficult than you would think, in 2029. And so the question is this predictive of the political developments in other countries and in your large neighbors? And in many ways it is, right? The shrinking of the center, right? The center has been magically shrinking everywhere. Meanwhile, the center-left has been in a startling decline, the German social democracy especially, but also the Greens, who appeared to once to be headed firmly for a central place in the political center, are really on the defensive right now in Germany. The decline of liberalism, that seems to be different. Our Liberal Party bumped itself out of the last elections in this February, mainly, I think, because of a particularly shrill imitation of Javier Milei's foreign policy line, which I gather D66 has not done, right? That is something the voters clearly didn't appreciate. And then finally, the fragmentation of the hard right, but also the radicalization of the hard right. In other words, it's not declining in real numbers, but it's going more and more to the right. You're seeing that everywhere, right? And it is visible in France, it is visible in the UK, it is visible in Germany, right? And what that tells us is people who try and imitate the hard right by adopting their language just lose out to the real thing. Right? And that's a phenomenon that we can expect to continue. And I think therein lies a lesson to the centrists, including to the current centrist German government. If you try and imitate that language, you will be punished in the next election. Right? The question then is how to fend them off. And Germany, while we will only have elections in 2029, we have 5 Länder elections, state elections, of the 16 Länder in Germany next year in 2026. And in one of those, at least in Saxony-Anhalt, the AfD is likely to be in a position to form the state government because it is likely to gain a majority and the other parties will not be able to coalition against it, right? So that will probably be a first opportunity to see the AfD in government, right? I think it's quite likely that the AfD in government will perform very much like Geert Wilders in government, which is incapable of governing, incapable of reaching compromises, incapable of articulating policy and following through on it, right? But that then brings us back to the big question of what happens here. If PVV and Geert Wilders stays on the outside, will they then revert to their role, or his traditional role as agenda setters, aggressively radical agenda setters from the outside, and challenging the centrists in government every single day, with the centrists very often really struggling to articulate and implement persuasive policies against that permanent barrage of populism. Right? That I think is the thing we're all going to be watching. Then, of course, there is the larger question of the transatlantic relationship, a Trump administration that is clearly keen on building bridges to the European hard right. Many of you will have read the famous State Department's Substack on the need for civilizational alliances in Europe, which explicitly name checks several of the hard right parties, including the AfD. And probably not all of you monitor this as obsessively as I do, but there has been a recent uptick of AfD visits to Washington. And only 2 days ago, a member of Congress, Representative Anna Paulina Luna, on X invited the co-chair of the AfD party, Alice Weidel, to Washington, who gratefully accepted. And the assumption is there will be a delegation, presumably headed by Weidel, coming here in December, right? And again, that that will make for a very interesting moment in the transatlantic relationship. It will be very, very difficult for the German government to handle, not least for the German embassy here, right? I mean, I can actually think of a nuclear version of that, which is if she brings Björn Höcke, the real leader of the party, who's in Thuringia, but who is the actual mastermind of the radicalization of the AfD. But yeah, that's, you know, would be a genuinely disturbing development, and one that I think would have repercussions really for the rest of Europe. The final point I want to quickly land on is the question of the Netherlands' role in Europe, and why I think it would be a really bad idea if the Dutch spent too much time negotiating a coalition. Right? Again, we have a Trump administration that is bent on liaising with the hard right in Europe. Some would go even farther there and say that it is encouraging, as it were, quote unquote, regime change in Europe. It is certainly still bent, right, on changing the global security, trade, and currency orders. And for a small and extremely open economy like the Netherlands, the results of that could be catastrophic. We saw that in the impact of that in Liberation Week. We were clawed back from the brink of economic catastrophes by markets and governments reacting. There is no assurance that that would happen a second time around, right? We have managed to persuade the Trump administration to sell us arms that we can give to the Ukrainians while we enable to increase our own defense industrial bases and build our own conventional defense and deterrence, but we are still dependent on the nuclear deterrent of America and on the strategic enablers, right? So in some ways, you know, and of course there's the EU-US trade deal, which some have described as a spectacular humiliation for the Europeans. I would say that wasn't the case. We have stabilized the relationship at 17% tariffs, but as we know, those tariffs are never stable. The hammer of geoeconomic coercion is only credible if it gets used again and again, right? So we are, in truth, in an extremely unstable global environment in which the Europeans are well advised to get their act together, to work with each other, and where I think our bandwidth, right, to, as it were, focus on our domestic issues to the detriment of the larger geoeconomic and geopolitical picture, and the role that the Dutch can play in it as a small country with a fair amount of economic power and a fair amount of influence. I would say the days where we had the luxury of limiting our bandwidth to that are over. And with that, my remarks are over.
Thank you. Your first point, I think is interesting on the sort of broader European, the relatively poor electoral performance of the center and left, even though D66, I think you can place there, and then the inability of the far right to govern effectively, though you may look at Italy and see an exception there.
But that's a different kind of personality than Geert Wilders,
Yeah.
right? There is some of you will have read the great column by Simon Cooper in the Financial Times, who says, there are the maximalists and the moderates, and Meloni, for example, right, has managed to position herself as a moderate populist. That's not to say that she hasn't tried to change the Italian constitution, right, to reduce important checks and balances, such as the strong role of the Italian president. Arguably, she's failed in that not because she tried, but because she didn't get it done. She couldn't muster the political support for that. But there are a lot of maximalists out there, and especially in Germany.
And so there, what you see, do you think it's fair to say, you have a lot of educational polarization now, that the center left ends up with a relatively small number of voters, very highly educated. The farther right, so to speak, ends up with lots of voters, but maybe struggles to staff a government. You see that here in the US a little bit too.
Of course. Absolutely.
And so why do you think Meloni has managed to avoid, because the VVD, I think, has tried to sort of carry out that balancing act too, but they haven't really been able to get back. This campaign, they were really trying to position themselves as, very distant from the center left. And it didn't really bring any voters back from the right? If you look at Wilders's voting, if you just look at the sort of radical right voting bloc in the Netherlands, it's remained intact. So they didn't really succeed in bringing any of those voters back.
But VVD is kind of unique, is that it's a one-man party, right? Like, I mean...
PVV.
PVV, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's Geert Wilders and there's
confused.
nobody else. I mean, did he
Exactly.
appoint any of his MPs as government ministers?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah,
very good.
yeah. Unfortunately, because
But they're not very good at
no,
it.
this is exactly the point. It's not a party.
Yeah.
It's a
It's a
one-man
one-man show.
movement.
Yeah, exactly.
He never invested in people. He never invested in a structure.
Like local even.
Just to give you an anecdote, and I was being asked at a certain moment, and I had the meeting with Geert Wilders and the other political leaders, whether I would like to lead the cabinet, which finally schoof that. One of my questions to him is, suppose I would be appointed as prime minister. I assume, Geert, that I have a veto, or at least a say, in who is going to be appointed as candidate ministers. You know what the answer was? Brutally honest. He said, no, of course you don't get a vote, a veto or a say in it. Because if you would veto one of my candidates, I have nobody else.
Yeah. You know who's like that in Germany is Sarah Wagenknecht, right? Who is on the left side of the spectrum, but has also sort of turned the party into a one-woman show, extremely rigid, very tightly controlled membership, very vague on policy issues, right? And interestingly, she has more or less flamed out for the moment, right? She is not really, she's still going on the talk shows, but she isn't really setting an agenda. But the thing to keep in mind, with a very fragile center and a declining center left, right, that is struggling to maintain its legitimacy, it doesn't take a lot of aggression, right, to continue undermining, and it doesn't take convincing policy positions, right, or convincing personality to continue fragilizing and undermining the center left, right? The challenge, the centrist parties, the challenge for the political center, and this shows that very clearly, right, is to take away the sort of air superiority over issue debates from the extreme right, right? And that is, and again, that doesn't sound to me like a moment in which you have a lot of time for coalition negotiations.
No, that's true. That's also what Rob Jetten said in the campaign. And I think that awareness is there at Democrat 66 and also the Green Left and Social Democrats. So especially on the point of migration and asylum policy, the next cabinet, if that would be a centrist cabinet or a broad centrist cabinet, has to deliver and fast. Because then you also show, because Geert Wilders, he has had the opportunity now. And that is the good thing, that's democracy. And he and the others, like BBB, the Farmers and Citizens Party, and also the new social contract, they failed. They were not able to do what you have to do in politics, to take tough decisions and to compromise. But it's a kind of a last chance, because if that promise is not going to be executed, yeah, then we will end up in 2 years from now with the next election. And then the question is, what was raised by one of you, what would Green Left Social Democrats get in exchange for that? Now, there's typical another issue which is important for both Democrat 66 and Green Left and Social Democrats, that's climate. Actually, the cabinet where I was part of, which was not with the Social Democrats and Green Left, but with the Christian Unions then, they made a very good start with the climate policy. And I think that VVD and definitely also CDA should be willing to make compromises there. Healthcare has been mentioned. Housing, they really could compromise there. What I'm worried about is that in the campaign, as has been said by you, there was not much time spent about the real issue, the very, very unstable geopolitical situation, the insecurity. I'm sometimes also in my current role surprised about the fact, like countries as in Finland, the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, that's of course a hot issue. They feel the heat of the war in Ukraine.
So,
Not to speak about Ukraine itself, which is fighting a war for Europe. That was not definitely on the radar of the voters this time.
Yep.
Is it in the manifestos of these parties which we just mentioned? Yes, it is. But that is, and I think that there is a bigger majority in Parliament, not only these four parties, to support it, but that is also difficult decisions about the defense expenditures, for example, and how to finance that.
can I come in on the back of that? Just to sort of clarify a point that I was trying to make earlier, but I think didn't sharpen enough, which is this: the big three in Europe, right, are all domestically more fragile, right, than is good for Europe in a situation of pressure from China, Russia, and now at the Trump administration, and that makes small countries less small. Right? It opens a political space, right, for the smaller countries to have greater influence, but then you have to want to do that. You have to want to have a take on the future of Europe. You have to want to have a debate on a national debate on geostrategy, and you will have to seek political allies. We are moving into an era of pragmatic alliances within Europe in order to advance certain policy issues, coalitions of the willing within Europe, because at the very least, at some point, if we try to do things at 27, the Hungarians and the Slovaks are going to veto, right? That means, in truth, right, that there is a great deal of potential power for a small country like the Netherlands. It also means that you cannot, I think, reduce yourselves to the position that you formerly had, which was to be part of the coalition of the frugal four, right? As in, let's not spend that number, let's not spend any money on anything. That is, I think, no longer a viable position at a time when we have to seriously do something about defense spending, about conventional defense and deterrence, and about growing Europe's economic competitiveness, right? These are really important challenges for the small countries. And let me add a final thing, which is, I think, how should I put this, hovering out there. There is, in many ways, now in Europe, a Western flank problem, right? The security environment in the North Atlantic and the Arctic is heating up, right? I don't think the interest of the Trump administration in Greenland is abated. In a hemispheric national security strategy and national defense strategy, it would play a very important role. And anybody who talks to the Danes or the Greenlanders, they're still very worried about that. In other words, if you are close to the North Atlantic and the North Sea, you do well to think about your defenses on the western periphery of Europe and how to. And that starts, frankly, with cognitive abilities. That starts with understanding what's going on in the North Sea and in the North Atlantic, right? And who your friends and partners are there. I can tell you from my own travels this year that the Icelanders, the Irish, the UK, the Norwegians are thinking very seriously about this. And you, of course, also have territorial waters and an exclusive economic zone where there are cables, right? There are devices, right? There are people who want to do seabed mining in the North Atlantic. I think all of that ought to be of interest to anybody who does national security strategy in the Netherlands.
Matthias?
I think on your point, Constance, I think the frugal four is kind of crumbling a bit, right? I mean,
Yeah, of course, yeah, it's already
I
gone.
think with the Merz government, of course, Germans were never technically part of the frugal four, or frugal five even, Austria, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. I think Denmark's gone from it. And what I remember from Rob Jetten, I think likely new prime minister of the Netherlands, And he said it very clearly. I think it was an interview with Politico where he said, I want us to be at the heart of Europe again. I want us to be part of the solution. I want us to do more stuff together. Because the Netherlands, unlike my Belgians that are always part of the solution in Europe, were very much of the Eurosceptic side. And I think Rutte was part of that, right? Always skeptical of Eurobonds, always skeptical of doing more, of giving more sovereignty to the EU. And I think you said it very well, Constance, at a moment where the big three, even though the UK is not in the EU, they still play a big role in Europe, are having difficulties domestically with domestic politics. I think the Netherlands, Spain, even Italy, Poland, right? These countries, middle size, have a bigger role to play.
Now that you mentioned the Belgians, and before we go to Q&A, Bart de Wever is another person who, is an example of someone who's quite successfully, I think, navigated sort of the space in between the traditional center right and the far right, right? He first in Antwerp and now nationally. How do you think that's going?
Yeah, so I mean, he's gotten quite some praise, with maybe the exception of the last EU summit over the reparation loan, where he'll come around in December, I expect. But it's interesting because I did think about this election and Bart de Wever because they just about beat the far right, the New Flemish Alliance. So it's kind of in a way that Europeetten just about beat Wilders. He has had to compromise and move up. And of course, in the Belgian context, it's compromising with the Wallonian French-speaking side, and that's much harder for a Flemish nationalist party to do. But in that sense, I think, yeah, he's struggling, but I think he's gotten on. What every Belgian politician finds when they're struggling domestically is they find Europe, because it's really not that far away from where they are. They can walk there.
Let's take a few questions before we call the day here. Let's go over here. And then, sorry, can you hold on a second?
The mic.
Wait for the mic. Sorry.
Hello.
Thank you.
Phyllis Berry, AGI. I wanted to ask a little bit again more about the defense and security policy. I mean, this previous government that fell, we can be critical of it, but actually on security defense Ukraine, it actually has a very strong record. I mean, I was just looking at the NATO numbers for spending. It's made as big a jump as, well, I mean, other than the Baltics, it's made a significant jump there. It's increased its support for Ukraine. It's in the Joint Expeditionary Force. I mean, it's actually been doing a lot of things. It's already in this northern swath of countries. So what more can we expect from the coalition that comes through? Because it seems to me they have stood up. Maybe they haven't played a leadership role, but they're definitely in this group of countries already. And it struck me that they were able to do this despite, what we thought of was a pretty dysfunctional government. It didn't seem to affect this at all. And I might just say that seems to me to be a difference between some of these smaller countries and larger countries, is that the smaller countries seem to be able to deal with dysfunctional governments and keep their security policy out of it to a more successful extent than some larger some larger
so
governments.
I think, and Marnix will go to you after. So I think the VVD was pretty strongly committed to keeping those commitments in place. Also, if you look at the sort of externally facing part of the scope of government, it was very conventional ministers who were picked there, very much establishment figures. Our defense spending numbers, the budgeted numbers are usually a little higher than the realized numbers. So that's something to keep in mind. But of the parties that are going to join now, the Christian Democrats have been, as you know, super committed to the Dutch role in NATO and to upping defense spending. Specifically, Marnix, I don't know if you have thoughts on what this is going to look like, but I would expect sort of a continuation of what we've seen in recent years.
Yeah. From the moment on that the war started, there was a big majority in Dutch parliament, and that didn't change when Cabinet Schoof came in, because this was exactly the point which was negotiated very well by VVD in the coalition agreement, because PVV was, let's say, not always the most credible party which you could count on in respect of this subject. So that was safeguarded also with the support of the opposition. and who were in the opposition, Democrat 66, the Green Left Social Democrats, and also Christian Democrats. And also, there's really a big support still for that, and that will continue. And I like it that you are mentioning it and not that I have to do it, because you're right, the Dutch really have contributed, and we are not shouting that from the roofs, as we say. We see that as our duty, not only in military, but also in budget support, of course, in EU, and that will continue, definitively. But the point which was made here, and I think that is absolutely something to consider very well the upcoming months. I agree with the analysis of the problem of the EU at the moment is that historically it were always France and Germany who took the political lead when there was a crisis situation in the EU, very successfully. I don't have to mention all of them you know it. And we have a problem there at the moment, of course, with the French elections coming up, the current French political climate. Germany, I'm a little bit more positive about, I must say. There is a coalition cabinet, and yeah, you're totally right that domestically, of course, the question is, will they hold the line and will they be convincing for the voters? But from a European side, I think they are taking the lead. The Dutch, they always said in the past, and we lost that position the last 2 years, they always said, okay, you don't belong to the largest countries, but you are also not a small country, so you're kind of in between. So it's basically looking at our economy, we are quite big. And if we count Belgium up, what I always like to do is my Belgian colleague at IMF, and even Luxembourg we count, and then we are the fourth. Then we are the fourth economy. So I think that also the Benelux Corporation couldn't be a driving force, not only Netherlands, in the EU. Take, for example, Draghi. Take the Draghi report. It's a nightmare if you look at the execution now on the Draghi report. Well, suppose the Benelux countries sit around the table. We are entitled to do that because the Benelux was earlier than the European Economic Community. So that's even an article in the treaty. We can go further in integration. So take the Draghi report, take the pluses, and say, let's move on as Benelux in a front-runner's role. I think that will also resonate. It's not an original idea because it's the Belgian Prime Minister, De Veuger, actually, who recently
I think he has more ambitious plans for Benelux integration.
Yeah. So I want to leave. I would like you to leave the room here with not only the Dutch flag, but with the Benelux flag, and to support your analysis that these so-called smaller countries can play a role. We should not overemphasize it. We should be humble, but not too humble.
Can I add a PS to that? We haven't mentioned yet Nexperia and ASML. Those two company names.
I mentioned it briefly when I said that trade policy is partially national.
But those two company names stand for the importance of Europe developing resilience against a very aggressive China, right? And there, I'm not sure that a Benelux alliance is going to cut it, right? I think that without a genuinely Europe-wide China policy that involves the EU Commission, right, we are not going to be able to stand up to Chinese bullying and interference in our place, which is already in our political space, which of course is taking place every day, right? So I think that's a case of where where you would see the limits of small countries going in alliances on their own.
Of course, here in the US, we're now engaged in the process of recoupling with China.
Yeah, well, that's also, but I mean, all right, let me say something on that. I would call that accommodationism, right? And that has consequences. I mean, that is something that I think Vladimir Putin is watching with great interest, right? And that has consequences for Russian Europe policy, and it has consequences for Europe, right? An American-China accommodation, right, is extremely bad news for Europe. And again, is an argument for us thinking beyond the sort of pragmatic coalitions of the willing in Europe and asking ourselves, are there fields in which we actually need to have Europe-wide integration in order to really produce resilience? And I don't mean that in the form of Mario Draghi, who says the EU needs to be a state. I think that's an interesting proposition, but politically unattainable. But I think there is always the possibility of intergovernmental consensus, but at the broadest level possible, right? And there may be. I mean, I'm not excluding the possibility of European integration, but I think the way that this normally goes is you have a crisis or you have sustained aggression from the outside, and then this starts with pragmatic fixes. It moves to the European Council taking action, and at some point you might have sort of EU integration, right? And I don't exclude any of those.
Let's go there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Dan Silverstein. I'm an American citizen, so I'm viewing all of this from afar. I noticed that the ambassador made a reference, and as did some of you, but to housing, which was not something I was aware of as a major problem. I've seen it a number of times, but it reminded me that several years ago I visited Oosterwald, and as part of the Almere planned community near Amsterdam. And I looked online, it says that Almere is supposed to have 325,000 residents in the next 25 years. So I'm wondering, is this planned community idea or the idea of having residency and agriculture as part of a combined unit of ownership a sustainable and scalable model that can address the housing issue, or is it too specialized to be considered?
Almere is in Flevoland, which, as you may know, was constructed relatively recently in the 1950s, I think, when we go live. And so that's really new land that was added to the country. I don't think we're planning to do that anywhere else. It was an interior sea, I guess, that was partially turned into land. That's where Almere was built. The D66 plan to build 10 new cities is a little bit in that spirit, right? Instead of expanding existing cities, building new cities sounds a little more ambitious. But as I mentioned, if you look into the details, a lot of the actual new cities they would build are simply expansions of existing cities or fill in.
Who would own that? These magical cities that they would suddenly.
It just means you remove land use restrictions and you let developers build cities, or you do social housing. It's similar to what you could do in the U.S., right? As I also mentioned, every Western country practically has this problem, where it's just become incredibly difficult to build new housing. You see that in every major American city too, right? You see this enormous disparity between the price of housing and construction costs. Right? That's true in San Francisco, it's true in Boston, it's true in New York, it's true here in DC. The home prices are just way above construction costs, and that the only reason why that happens is because there's just an enormously inelastic supply side. And so that's the problem we need to address, and you can do that in different ways. The Netherlands has very sharp sort of urban-rural transitions. That may be what you were thinking about. That's in part just a consequence of being a denser, more carefully planned country than the U.S. I don't think that's going to change, right? So these new cities would presumably form similar urban planning principles. But I'm not super optimistic. It's started to dominate the politics of a number of, if not countries, at least major cities. Someone mentioned Zoran Mamdani.
Okay.
It's by far the dominant issue in Barcelona, in London,
Berlin.
in Berlin, in a number of major cities, obviously in San Francisco. And so I'm not super optimistic, but there's definitely a lot of growing discontent. It could be, like you could envision a world where it becomes a major issue for the center left. The problem, of course, is that I think there are too many people on the center left who are pretty uncomfortable with letting private developers just build a ton of housing. They have now become sort of intertwined with an environmental movement that is very concerned with citizen voice, with protecting even what I would consider not particularly valuable bits of nature. And so I don't really see that they're going in that direction, but they could. It certainly is a major issue in the Netherlands and elsewhere. Yeah. Let's take one more question, and then, yes, let's go over there. Please wait for the mic. Please wait for the mic.
Thank you. I think I have a loud voice, though. Thank you. So,
Not loud enough to reach the people who are watching on C-SPAN. So.
Okay. So thank you, Jorge Guzman. Thank you for the very collegial talk. I appreciate the macro perspectives and the political economy perspectives as well. I think they're all great. However, I think that some of the issues, for example, in New York, is that Mandami, I think, is facing failed politicians because Cuomo and also the former mayor.
We're not talking about the New York
Okay.
mayoral race. Okay. Do you have a question about the Netherlands?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think that, have you considered that maybe it's a culture war in Europe? Because I noticed that you talk about, I'm an economist, that you talk about macro, you talk about political economy, international relations, but maybe it's that people at the micro level don't feel identified with the people who represent them, and that's why they vote differently. Maybe they want other issues. Maybe they want a cross, like in France, to be in a room, and they don't see that anymore. So there's a backlash.
Let me answer the question. So, we hinted at it, right? So we talked about migration being a major issue. We talked about educational polarization. I do think what you see in a lot of European countries is you see this shift away from traditional parties to new parties because I think there's a couple of issues where the broader voting public it doesn't feel represented by the elite opinion, right? So migration has been one. I think climate policy is one where there's just a pretty big divide between what the people want. I do not think religion is one in the Netherlands. I think, if anything, the political establishment is more religious than voters, right? You have, I think, if you look at the Christian Democrats, you look at the Christian Union, the SGP, you have a number of parties that, where certainly the active membership is much more interested in organized religion than voters at large. In this campaign, in fact, the Christian Democrats, I think, took a hit near the end of the campaign because its leader, Henry Bontebal, he spoke, maybe somewhat clumsily in defense of the Dutch system of school choice, where parents can set up a school. All schools, including religious ones, are funded directly by the government. Those religious schools can teach the tenets of their religion. That probably lost the Christian Democrats, I would guess, 5 to 6 seats. So I think if a Dutch politician were to push for more crosses in classrooms, I think that would be an extremely ineffective electoral campaign. And so that's not an issue, I think, where you have that kind of divide in the Netherlands. You may have it here in the US a little bit, but I don't think that's true in the Netherlands.
Where you do have it is, of course, the urban-rural divide, right? And that's very similar across here. And I mean, you mentioned nitrogen, right?
Yes,
nitrogen
exactly.
is a very unsexy topic for your typical AEI or Brookings audience. But I grew up with a father who was a veterinarian who got into politics, Christian democratic politics. And if you go around farmers, I mean, the BBB and their sort of rise, I think it's to do with this issue. Right?
I mean, they have like 13 senators. I don't think they're underrepresented.
Yeah, and they're not underrepresented at all. But I think it's one of those issues where these policies that are set in Brussels or in cities, usually by people that are very well educated, that still think milk comes from Whole Foods or something like this, right? That are completely disconnected. Some of these regulations are really killing local, I think, communities. And that, I think, there's a better understanding coming. I like to think with CDA being back in Dutch government, there's going to be more of a compromise there, but we'll see.
Good. I like it that you mentioned it only 1 minute, because this is exactly what happened in 2020. So we had an extremely, we came up as cabinet, and I was also responsible for that, with nitrogen changes in the policy, which was basically the translation of what the EU directive had written, and several Dutch governments had not delivered there. And then you saw the big mismatch between what was logically maybe right, and we discussed it in the cabinet meeting, and then I started traveling through the country, all the provinces, because my party was originally always very well based in all the regions. And then all of a sudden, sitting at the kitchen table with farmers, whether it was in Limburg or in Groningen in the north of the country, I figured out, oh my gosh, we have here a total mismatch.
Yep.
And that is the cultural divide that almost killed my party in the last elections. We ended up with 5 seats. And now, of course, we have, and also Rob Jetten, Democrat 66, because they were pretty sharp in that debate at that moment, he said, yeah, we should really more compromise there. And yeah, that was my personal experience, which I also have written down in my book, which will be published in 2 weeks from now.
Excellent.
Constance, do you want the closing word?
Do you have a book?
I would like to come in on the point that we haven't talked about yet, which is, some of you have heard me talk about this elsewhere, so I beg your forgiveness, but this is a moment of anti-system actors, right? Anti-system great powers and anti-system political actors who are deliberately, strategically, intentionally destroying existing orders. Security, trade, currency, domestic constitutional orders. It is not a coincidence, as the conspiracy theorists say, that the hard right parties especially try to unpick, destroy the functionality of representative democracy. Right? Whom does that benefit and what methods do they use? Right? It benefits, I would say it benefits the people who already have a lot of power, right, and who want more power and who don't want restrictions on their power. And the methods that they use is farming the rage, the resentment, and the fear of people who have no power. Right? It's, I mean, forgive me for putting it this bluntly, right? But you can see that happening in this country, and you can see it happening elsewhere. Right? So in that sense, I would say there are certainly. I don't want to in any way, as a way, dismiss the existence of real identity grievances. But I think the important thing to also understand is that the people who stand to profit from the exploitation of these grievances are not the people who have the grievances.
Absolutely.
Good. Well, on that, I share your hope that the existing order will be preserved, unmutable and eternal. And on that note, let's...
No, I don't think it should be immutable and eternal. We have to be able to adapt it, right? I mean, that's the challenge. But the challenge is preserving the functionality of states, markets, and civil societies. Forgive me, I'm sorry, I get picky about these phrases.
No, we can agree to disagree.
Yeah, good.
Good. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching.